See, a few weeks ago, I was a witness to a horrible tragedy.
We don't talk often enough about the fact that witnessing a trauma is traumatic. It's not just going through it firsthand, but vicarious traumatization is a thing. It's real. And being a witness to something or hearing details, graphic details over and over, even if you weren't a witness to that, can be traumatic for sure.
Can you explain what happens in your brain when you witness something like that?
Okay, so really quickly, for those who may not be, well versed in what's going on in the brain, let's talk about what happens in a regular event, a normal event, how that gets filed away, and then we can talk about what happens when you've got something sufficiently overwhelming.
That sounds great.
So, if your brain was a video game, its goal would be homeostasis, and what that means is just equal blood flow, equal electrical activity across the whole cortex. Now, that rarely happens because your brain is constantly taking in information and filing it away, both from inside the system, inside your body, and also from outside in the world. So when you've got a normal event, let's say you go to the grocery store and something mildly funny happens, anywhere between 4 and 24 hours after that event, your brain gets filed away into a file room. This is primarily in an area of the brain called the hippocampus. This is what I would love to film a Pixar movie about, where if you have this file room with all these multicolored file cabinets, and then there's these little file room workers who are running around trying to put your memories away in an order that enables your brain to pull them out when it needs it and make sense of it. Because your whole system is wired for safety. And the better we remember things, the more likely it is that we are to survive. So when you have a normal event going on, you've got relative homeostasis in your brain, meaning you have access to all of the parts of your brain that are needed in order to complete that filing system.
Well, what happens when you are in a situation where the memory gets properly filed away?
So between 4 and 24 hours after an event, it gets filed away. And then when it gets filed away properly and in an organized fashion, that means that you can reach for that file later when you need it, pull it out, talk about it, and then put it away and continue on with your day. So let's say I'm like, oh, I want to tell you about this funny thing that happened at the grocery store. I can really easily reach for that file, tell you the narrative content, feel some of the feelings. Maybe I laugh again as if it's happening again. And then I can put it away and we can continue on doing whatever we were doing. So that's a normal event. That's what your brain wants and needs to happen.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you now explain what happens in a traumatic situation or even just a situation where the alarm or anxiety in your body just starts to go off?
When you've got something sufficiently overwhelming going on, the homeostasis in your brain goes totally out of whack on purpose. This is an evolutionary adaptation that happens so that you can handle the threat or the danger that is in front of you. And so your brain, when the alarm system goes off, this is in your limbic system, your amygdala, it reprioritizes 47 different functions in your brain and body to prepare you for what it is sensing is a danger. One of the things, so that's adaptive and it's really cool. And I'll tell you why I'm emphasizing that in a second. One of the things that kind of goes offline, however, is the file room. So if you can imagine all those file workers, they run out of the hippocampus because they are needed elsewhere to handle the threat. So instead of this neatly organized file folder that you get between 4 and 24 hours after the event, you get instead a fragmented file folder. And each file folder needs that narrative content so I can tell you the story, the emotional content so I can feel a little bit how it feels, and then a tag that tells me in my brain what it means. How do I find it? How do the file room people go and find it? So when you have an overwhelming event, this adaptation happens in the brain and in the system. And what that then means is that the file room workers aren't there. So you get this fragmented file. The file room workers come back into the room and they're like, oh no, we have a fragmented file. We don't like a fragmented file. We like everything to be in order. We don't know where to put this. We don't know where it goes. So they kind of keep it sort of in a queue so that it can go to the front of your mind whenever you experience anything that is similar to something in that fragmented file, which will give you the opportunity to organize it all over again. So this is the origin of the trauma trigger. Again, this is your brain trying to help you by telling you, Oh, okay. So let's say you have this fragmented file. It has like post-it notes in it. Your brain doesn't know what it means. It's just sitting there in the file room on top of one of the drawers. And let's say the color red is in that file. And then you come across that same exact shade of red in the universe, right? Someone walks across your periphery and they're wearing that same color. The file room dudes say, "Oh my God, here's a chance. You need to organize the file." And so they throw that to the front of your mind to give your brain the opportunity to organize it. Hey, we have a fragmented file. We don't like that. Let's throw it to the front of mind, give you this opportunity. And then the problem is your amygdala, that limbic system, also recognizes that color red, and it has coded that red as mortal danger. So it goes and sets off the alarm system all over again. And then you're off and running, even though you're sitting at your desk at your office. So that's essentially what happens between when you have a regular event and then when you have a traumatic event.
That makes total sense. And I love the explanation of a fragmented file because that's how I feel. I feel like I've got these little snippets of the whole experience, like the red and white towel that I was waving, the super windy breeze blowing the towel and how heavy it was, the sound of the helicopters, the sound and the spotlights of them once it got darker, the police boats, the horns. There are all these snippets. And then 24 hours later, when I heard that they had not found him yet, all of these little fragments feel like they're floating around in my brain. You said that this is how we're designed and that it's adaptive. How is that adaptive? I mean, that sounds like maladaptive. I just kind of want this traumatic thing to go back in my brain in the filing cabinet, and I don't want to think about it again.
That's a great question. I think what there's like a fine line between adaptation and maladaptation. And I think it's really important that we understand. So, what I've just described is essentially the origin of the trauma response. And I think it's critical that we understand that the trauma response is adaptive and it's designed to help keep you alive. It is sort of born of a will to survive. And the reason that's important is because when we try to heal from trauma, we often go immediately to a shame place. If I have trauma and I'm dealing with these symptoms, this means there's something wrong with me. I am broken. And so when we start by understanding that it is an adaptive move that gives you the symptom that is eventually maladaptive, then I think it can help us heal because we can peel away that layer of shame. But you're right. It is something that started out as adaptation that becomes over time maladaptive. And what you're describing is kind of like the trick when it comes to treating trauma, which is integration. How do we take that file folder and figure out how to organize it and put it away so that it looks more or less like the rest of your files without continuing to get triggered over and over and over again?
Exactly. I mean, for me, that's the $100 million question. How do you integrate, as you say, these experiences so that you're not re traumatized? Because that's exactly what I've been doing to myself. I mean, this is also just a few days old in terms of my experience, but I continue to go over and over and over in my mind, like, how are these poor parents feeling and the family members? And oh my God, the anguish of them going back and forth on the beach. And I saw that there was a GoFundMe page and I donated to it. And I just keep feeling this heartbreak over and over and over again. And then, of course, I feel bad because I go, why am I torturing myself? And why do I feel so gripped and devastated by this? I'm not even a member of their family. I didn't know who died. And so, I would love to talk about both why you feel conflicted when you have these sort of traumatic experiences. Why are your emotions kind of unsettling? And I also think, for the sake of everybody listening, this is so fresh for me, but every one of us has had a traumatic experience in our life, whether it is a death when you were in high school of a classmate, or maybe somebody in your family, or something that happened in your community. Every single one of us has either had an experience like this or will have one. And I would love to learn the specific steps, Dr. Mary Catherine, that we all can take so that even after the fact, we can properly file these memory files of what we saw, how we feel, the emotions inside of us into the right file cabinet so that we can move on with our lives. We can stop being re-traumatized by it. And that's exactly where I want to go with you when we return. So stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Mel Robbins, and I'm here with Dr. Mary Catherine McDonald, who's a trauma specialist who has been researching trauma and working with people for decades. And we're talking about a very traumatic incident where a swimmer went missing, and the search and recovery mission took place right in front of the house that we went for days. So, Dr. Mary Catherine, let's talk about integration. How exactly do we integrate a traumatic incident into our life moving forward?
This has been the thing that sort of the field of neuroscience and psychology and psychiatry have been trying to figure out since the 1800s. How do we circumvent the alarm system and organize the memory file? There are a lot of different modalities that can accomplish this, but basically at a base level, what you're looking for when you're aiming at integration is a narrative of the event that doesn't have any holes. So it has a coherence, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and some amount of emotional content. So if I tell you a funny story, I'm going to maybe laugh. I feel some of those emotions. If I tell you a sad story, I'm going to maybe tear up and feel a little bit sad. That's okay. Our memory files are supposed to have emotion, and then a set of meaning tags. What does this event mean in the larger story arc of your life? So typically, I think I'm a huge advocate for multiple modalities when it comes to integration, because we're always in it for a quick fix. And we want to say, okay, I want to do 5 sessions of something and then get this integrated. But typically we need more things because your entire system is along for the ride. It's not just a file problem. Your body is involved as well. So just to give you a quick rundown, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprioritizing, is a modality that's designed to sort of short circuit the fear center from setting the alarm off. So what happens is the clinician will occupy your vision. Usually, I mean, the first ways that they used to do this was just to wave a finger back and forth in front of your face. So think like old school hypnosis with like a little pocket watch. And when your visual cortex is occupied, when you're talking about the memory, what you're essentially doing is manually creating homeostasis in your brain. You're manually pushing blood flow and electrical activity to the parts of your brain that are trying to get disconnected by the alarm system. So EMDR is one modality. Narrative therapy is a great modality. Sometimes people use alternative medicines like psilocybin or MDMA, both of which are thought to turn off the fear center and enable you to talk through the memory and integrate it without having that overactive alarm.
One thing that I keep thinking about is the fact that, other people in my family and some friends of ours all witnessed this exact same thing. And our 2 friends were just as shaken up as I was. But some of our family members were not, at least on the surface, as triggered as I have been by this. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? Why you can witness the exact same event or have the exact same traumatic experience, but 2 people side by side have a very different trauma response to it?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that's really interesting about these file folders, and this is something that has been interesting to track through the history of the study of trauma, is that since a file folder can be fragmented in one of a billion different ways, this means that the symptoms that come after the event can also look very different, even for 2 people who went through the exact same event. And the reason that's important historically is because we used to use that fact to shame people and say, okay, let's use a combat veteran, for example. You have 2 soldiers that fought in the same war, in the same battalion, having the same job. They witnessed the same thing. One of them comes out and they have all of these overactive emotions. The other person is totally shut down. So the person who's having the overactive emotions, there must be something wrong with them aside from combat, because this person next to him seems to be doing quite fine. And in reality, what's happening is that the fragmented files can be creating different emotions. For some people, that creates a whole lot of upset, distress, crying, outward kind of feelings of anxiety. For other people, it causes total shutdown. And so they seem to be talking about an event and not having any emotional response to it, or they just don't feel anything at all. And in the media, we use, when we talk about somebody who has PTSD or someone who's dealing with trauma, we usually use an example of someone who's having an overly charged response. They're crying too much. They're having, this sort of quote unquote hysterical response. But from a clinician's standpoint, if someone comes in and they're telling you this story that is the most horrible thing they've ever seen and there's no emotional content, then we can see really clearly that that part of the file folder isn't there, right? So they have the story, they don't have the emotional content. That still requires integration, right?
So are you saying that everyone who sees a traumatic event has some kind of trauma or fragmented file?
Good question. No, because it depends on the whether or not the file gets consolidated between 4 and 24 hours after the event. For some people, they have the opportunity to consolidate that memory, even if it was really overwhelming in the moment. Let's say they get home and they're able to talk to their partner or their family about it, assign some meaning to it, and put it away. Then that file is going to start looking really quickly like the other files in their file cabinet. So there was a study, I think it was in Israel, and they took folks who had just been through a terrorist attack in the emergency room. And they had one group go through a narrative therapy exercise where they had to talk through the event kind of over and over, assign it meaning, feel through some of the content with someone who was able to attune to them. And then the other people just got sort of the standard of care in the emergency room. The people who went through that event and they were able to narrate and integrate the memory right away were something like 80% less likely to have PTSD from going through the event than somebody who just went through this, standard of care that you get in the emergency room. So it really depends on kind of what goes on immediately after the event. We focus so often on the type of event and whether it's traumatic and not the person who went through it and then what happens in the aftermath. If someone is there to help you in the right way to integrate the memory, it's a lot less likely to become traumatic. In my work, I've kind of readapted the definition of trauma because this is the thing we've been arguing about in the field of psychology since the 1800s. Which events are traumatic, which are not? And it's like, guys, this is not the point. And the definition that I use is that anytime you have something that gives you an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home, you have a potential for a chronic trauma.
Today's show is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a tough one. I was a witness to a horrible tragedy. Even if it's hard or it feels very uncomfortable to listen to parts of what we're going to talk about, this is important.